Welcome to the Podkey summary of what's new in shortcuts from WWDC 2026. This update to shortcuts feels like Apple taking a bunch of things that used to be a little fiddly and making them much more usable in real life. Automations now live right inside the main editor. There are a few genuinely useful new triggers. Apple Intelligence can pull in current web info from inside a shortcut, and Shortcuts finally gets built-in storage, so your workflows can remember things from one run to the next. A lot of this is about making shortcuts feel less like one-off tricks and more like small apps you can actually live with. One of the biggest quality of life changes is that automations are now editable directly in the Shortcuts editor alongside regular actions. Instead of bouncing out to a separate automation interface, you can browse, add, and configure them in place, which sounds modest until you remember how much friction that old split added. It makes setup faster, but just as important, it makes automations easier to discover because they're no longer tucked away in their own little corner. Apple also added 3 new automation types: when a screenshot is saved, when an external keyboard connects or disconnects, and when a notification from a specific app arrives. The screenshot one opens up some handy cleanup or filing workflows, and the keyboard trigger is great for people who move between a more desktop-like iPad setup and a handheld one. The notification trigger is probably the most interesting because it can also filter by keyword. So you can do something very specific, like turn on the porch lights only when a delivery app sends a notification containing the word arriving, instead of reacting to every single alert that app throws at you. That notification feature also comes with a quiet little lesson for developers. If a notification is concise and includes a clear verb, a specific entity like a driver name, and a time estimate, it's much easier for shortcuts to parse and act on. Apple's human interface guidelines already recommend that structure, and now there's an extra reason to care, because well-written notifications become reliable automation triggers for users. Basically, a good notification isn't just nicer to read, it can become part of somebody's workflow. The use model action also gets a pretty meaningful upgrade. It can now access larger Apple Intelligence models that are able to browse the web, which means a shortcut can work with up-to-date information instead of only whatever was already on device. A straightforward example is trip planning. If you've got an upcoming trip on your calendar, a shortcut could ask for current events related to that destination and pull fresh info from the internet right then. That's a nice shift from static helper to something more context-aware and current. There's also a very practical debugging improvement here. A show content action can display the raw transcript that's being sent to the model, so you can actually see which entity fields made it into the prompt. In one example, that exposed why the model picked a mild soup when the goal was to find a spicy one. The problem wasn't that the model had bizarre soup opinions. The input simply didn't include enough detail about spice level. The fix was to enrich the entity itself. By adding an ingredients array to the soup entity, the model suddenly had enough context to choose a genuinely spicy soup. Before that, it was mostly working from the soup's name and whether it was available, which left it effectively blind to the thing that actually mattered. It's a good reminder that model quality isn't only about the model, the schema you hand it shapes the result in a very direct way. The other big feature is storage. Shortcuts now has actions that let you save arbitrary values between runs, including lists, numbers, and even app entities. There's also a dedicated storage view in the editor where you can create, inspect, and edit those values, which makes the whole thing feel much less hidden and much more manageable. This is the kind of feature that turns shortcuts from momentary actions into stateful workflows that remember what happened last time. Some of those saved values can be global, which means multiple shortcuts can access the same data. That's especially useful for shared secrets like API keys, because you don't have to duplicate the same value across a bunch of different shortcuts. Apple includes getter and setter actions for these values, so reading and updating them is pretty straightforward. Once you have storage, you can do simple but surprisingly smart things, like keep a list of soups, you've already chosen, and tell use model to avoid repeats next time. The same pattern works for a daily motor racing fact shortcut, where the goal is just to not hear the same fact every morning. And because stored values sync through iCloud, that history follows you between devices. So an iPad run can pick up where your iPhone left off. The catch is that entities need stable identifiers across devices. Using something like a database row ID for a soup means every device recognizes it as the same object, and actions like order soup still work. If those identifiers change from device to device, the whole cross-device memory trick starts to fall apart. Taken together, these updates make shortcuts feel more mature. It's easier to build automations, easier to feed models, better context, and finally possible to give your shortcuts a memory without a pile of workarounds. And honestly, any app that can remember which soup I've already had is doing solid work. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.